starting out with our Human Resources Director, Brayton Connor, is going to give us an update on the OSHA ETS situation and also the New York State State of Emergency and Governor Hochul's mask or approved vaccination. Before I hand the baton to Brayton, I just want to say that we've been chuckling, Brayton, that when we decided to do the update today, it was probably 8 or 9 days ago.
Correct.
And I said, Brayton, if I were you, I wouldn't even start preparing for that update till about 2 o'clock on Thursday, because this thing is changing by the hour. And that ended up being sage advice, huh?
Yes, Mr. Supervisor, that was excellent advice. Topic is COVID. There's 3 sections to it. The OSHA ETS, the New York State indoor mask mandate, and modifications to the isolation quarantine rules. As you alluded to, I did start my preparation at around 11 o'clock this morning and finished it up. And then I got a text from you announcing that the Supreme Court had made a ruling in the case. And so then I had to go back and make some adjustments to my briefing. So for the OSHA ETS, I thought I'd kind of go through kind of basically the timeline of where we're at, which is in September, President Biden announced that he had an intention to impose a vaccine mandate on large employers, but it wasn't until November 5th that OSHA released the rules, the ETS, Emergency Temporary Standard. Employers were only given 30 days in which to devise, adopt, and distribute a policy and to obtain the vaccine status of all employees. And this coincided over the Thanksgiving week. It was in there, and that made some of our communication and deliberations complicated. After that, 30 days later, was supposed to be the implementation of the either mandatory vaccination or the mandatory mask and test protocols, and that was going to fall over the Christmas and New Year's holiday, another banner time for communicating with employees and decision makers. 2 months ago, I was here letting you know about the OSHA ETS once we determined that it would apply to the town of Webster. Initially, I did not think it would, but my understanding was corrected. And so that was November 12th. A number of lawsuits were initiated, and around 11/28, the town distributed a OSHA ETS compliant policy and began collecting vaccination statuses. Within 48 hours, though, the town did some further legal analysis and decided that there was a stay on OSHA, and also PESH had not weighed in. And so based on risk assessment, the decision was made to hold off until the litigation situation clarified itself. Shortly after that, on December 17th, the 6th U.S. Court of Appeals dissolved the stay against OSHA, and OSHA set new deadlines of January 10th for policy implementation and February 9th for the actual implementation of the mask and test protocol. Shortly thereafter, the Supreme Court said that it would hear oral arguments on the case, and kind of going through that process, like, well, we know we're going to have a final resolution on this in a relatively short period of time. Last week, Friday the 7th, the Supreme Court held oral arguments and said that they would issue a ruling quickly. Monday the 10th, the OSHA ETS policy went into effect, although OSHA had said they would not take compliance actions if jurisdictions were showing, or companies were showing good faith effort, and we'd certainly done that by devising a compliant policy. Then today at 3 p.m., just as I finished up my briefing, the Supreme Court ruled in a 6-3 ruling to block the OSHA ETS mandate. And a couple of highlights that I took from that order are as follows. The reasoning is the rules draw no distinction based on industry or risk exposure to COVID-19. COVID-19 is not an occupational hazard and can be spread at home and schools, during sporting events, and everywhere else that people gather. That kind of universal risk is no different from the day-to-day dangers that all face from crime, air pollution, or any number of communicable diseases. Permitting OSHA to regulate the hazards of daily life simply because most Americans have jobs and face these same risks while on the clock would significantly expand OSHA's regulatory authority without clear congressional authorization. So that is kind of the basis of the Supreme Court's actions. Well, while we were working through the OSHA situation, New York State announced on Friday, December 10th, that effective Monday, December 13th, there would be an indoor mask mandate, and basically it said that facilities have to be either 100% vaccinated, so not allowing any unvaccinated folks to work or visit there, or they had to be 100% mask wearing. And so the town implemented and briefed managers on the policy and employees on the policy prior to them coming to work on that Monday. And the policy was originally set to expire on January 15th, which is just around the corner. The governor announced the other day that the New York indoor mask mandate is extended for at least 2 more weeks through February 2nd. And then, we'll see what happens next. Overall, there have been, there's been the vast majority of customers and visitors have been compliant, although there have been a few cases where, employees had to come kind of face-to-face with this public discussion over the issue of masking and, take appropriate steps to protect themselves and to, keep a compliant environment. Another thing that was going on in the COVID world in the last 2 weeks is the change in isolation and quarantine guidance. As you recall, when COVID originally came upon the scenes, the guidance was 14-day quarantine. Around Christmas of last year, it was modified to 10-day quarantine. It's been 10-day quarantine kind of up until last week. So December 24th, New York State issued some modified guidance that said for essential personnel, such as highway, sewer, police, and healthcare workers, that if they were fully vaccinated, they could limit their isolation period to 5 days if need be for making sure essential services were delivered. 3 days later, on the 27th, the CDC put out a recommendation saying that the 5 days should apply to all people regardless of vaccination status. I think that was a Friday, or that was midweek. The county stated that it would not follow those guidelines on the 3rd of January. On the 4th of January, CDC updated its recommendations, although primarily they just addressed what's called congregate settings, like schools, hospitals, jails, things where there's lots of people living together, nursing homes. Then on the 4th of January, New York State adopted the CDC regulations, and then on the 6th of January, the county adopted them. Basically, what it is there's a 5-day there's a 5+5 protocol. You isolate or quarantine for 5 days. At the end of that, you wear a mask for 5 days, but you can come back to work after 5. There's other details in there, which we've completed a flow chart, and I provided a copy of the flow chart there for you that contains pretty much the language from the health department, because there's a lot of if, then, else's, and that works very nice for math equations. Pick your own path storybooks, but it's kind of hard to administer, and hopefully this tool will help with that. So then just on the 11th of this week, New York State has said that the local health departments no longer have to contact trace for COVID, which means that if you test positive, you won't be getting those phone calls that say, tell us who else you were with and exposed to, and we'll add them to the list. Basically, the county is now moved to a self-reporting model, and this will, one of the effects is this will help us with our staffing, because during this last peak, the health department obviously wasn't staffed for Omicron, and we would direct employees to go to the health department to either get a quarantine order or to be cleared from quarantine if they were fully vaccinated. And that used to take like 12 hours, then it got into like a couple of days. So now you go to the website, you self-report, you get your quarantine orders, and then that way we as an employer know exactly how long you should be out and when, according to the health department, you can come back to work. So what happens next? Who knows? But at least today we know that the OSHA ETS is not going to be happening next. Again, the New York State indoor mask mandate continues to be in place through the end of February 1st, and department heads and employees continue to face the challenge, staffing challenges due to absences, and quite frankly, concern for their safety over COVID exposures.
So I have a question with respect to this mask mandate and the differences in different situations, okay? In the situation I'm going to propose, or the example I'm going to give is you can walk into a restaurant and you have to have your mask on. As soon as you sit down, you can take your mask off, right? So I walk in here with my mask on and I sit down, I have to keep it on. So are those guidelines separate to restaurants than they are for the general public in different settings?
So Councilman Cahill, you bring up an excellent question about consistency, and the answer is it depends on which mandate we were talking about. So the situation, and what you described were the rules last year under New York State. The rules right now are supposedly that if you go to a restaurant, you can only take off your mask in between bites of food. So I have not been to a restaurant recently to observe compliance for that.
I've seen him eat. You could never have your mask on.
Yeah. It's just fast and furious.
But I think that answer perhaps reinforces the purpose of your question. That there's a line between the science and the intent and reality, and they cross over in several situations.
Yeah.
That's for the health department to defend and the policymakers to opine on.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate it.
And I don't want us to ask you questions that are putting you in a position where it's outside of your expertise and it's speculative. Would you speculate that the reason the health departments are like, we're not going to be making these calls is it's just, there's too many numbers. When you have 2,000 to 3,000 people testing positive, now exponentially the contact rate. I know that a year ago, when the seasonal spike went up, our testing was like 200 or 300 a day, and they were having a hard time keeping up with that. How are they going to keep up to 2,000 or 3,000? Is that essentially why they said no more?
I would agree with you, and I'll speculate that there are two reasons that fall under the same category of too many cases to handle. I mean, one is a staffing issue. You can only flow so much through, so much water through a hose. The other is, probably from a scientific standpoint, contact tracing. The theory is that if you can identify sources and contagions, then you can limit the exposure of whatever the thing happens to be, whether it's tuberculosis or COVID-19. Well, with Omicron, it's basically everywhere, and it's spread. It's easily enough and fast enough that by the time you make contact tracing calls, there's no point. Plus, with a reduced 5-day quarantine, you really, it's too late. And so it's, I believe the word is endemic instead of pandemic. So I will then conclude my amateur science, because now I'll get past any level of knowledge.
I have nothing to add. Thank you, Brayden. This
Thank
is
you,
an
Brayden.
ever-changing landscape, and I certainly appreciate your staying on top of it and reporting to us.
All right, and probably like everybody in the world, I can't wait to not have to deal with this.